We've been keeping tabs on the I-5 bridge replacement project between Portland and Vancouver. The leader is soon stepping down. A new cost estimate is expected next month, and a critical hurdle involving the U.S. Coast Guard is ahead. And it's our big story tonight. So the Interstate Bridge Replacement Team, or IBR, has submitted its updated report to the U.S. Coast Guard. The big issue is the height of the new bridge and how that relates to clearance for boats passing underneath. Even though we're less than a year away from construction starting, if all goes to plan, we still don't know for sure how tall this thing is going to be and whether it will be a fixed span or include a movable span. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, last week we brought you highlights from our one-on-one interview with the outgoing IBR leader, Greg Johnson. Here's what he said about the difference between those bridge designs.
So a fixed span, of course, has no movable parts. The current bridge is a movable span. It's a lift bridge where that section of the bridge goes up to allow river traffic to pass underneath. That's taller than the other spans. So movable spans are notoriously expensive and notoriously difficult to manage. You have built-in operations and maintenance costs forever because you have to staff it 365 days a year.
The IBR team has a clear preference. They want a fixed span, and they want it to be 116 feet high. But they don't get the final say. It's ultimately up to the Coast Guard because they need to issue a permit before construction can begin. Now, this has been a thorny issue all the way back to the failed Columbia River crossing plan more than a decade ago. Here's why. The current drawbridge can lift all the way to 178 feet, which is what the Coast Guard and others have been working with for more than a century. A few years ago, when IBR basically asked the Coast Guard how high they would like the new bridge, they were told 178 feet. So, IBR has been on a mission to convince the Coast Guard to approve their plan of 116 feet.
The Coast Guard, their sole interest is is river traffic being impeded. So we don't criticize the Coast Guard. That's their mission and we understand it. But we think we have put forth a solution that can satisfy all needs and all users, both on the river and in those other modes.
Is there anything specific that goes into 116 just as opposed to 115, 117? Like what makes it that number?
The 116 allows us to have ramp grades because there's a lot of truck traffic and freight traffic that comes through that corridor to allow those trucks to get up those ramps and up to speed in a reasonable way. You start building it steeper, they have trouble getting up to speed.
Okay, that solution that Johnson referenced earlier is what the updated report is all about, which stresses that the 116-foot option is enough for 99% of river traffic. But what about that remaining 1%? Well, for starters, it's not always as simple as just asking, is the boat more than 116 feet tall? Each vessel has its own preferred air gap. That's an extra safety margin between the top of the ship and the bottom of the bridge. And in some of these cases, the report concludes that shaving a few feet off of that buffer can make the difference. The Columbia River's height also changes with the tide, so there are a few vessels that sometimes might be unable to cross. With those caveats in mind, the report says no government or recreational vessel operators would be significantly impacted by the 116-foot design. But 4 commercial companies would be, and they're named in the report: JT Marine, Advanced American Construction, Greenberry, and Thompson Metal Fab. Each of them either operates a vessel that would be too tall or occasionally uses the river to ship things that would also be too tall. In each case, the report says IBR reached a confidential agreement with the companies to mitigate those impacts.
We have been working with the affected river users and to get to an agreement where they will maintain their presence in the locations, but either build smaller modules that can fit underneath the 116-foot bridge, or have a satellite site that can build the bigger things downstream of our bridge.
In a news release on Tuesday, IBR said all of those agreements total around $140 million. The team argues that's a bargain when you compare it to a movable span design, which they say would cost at least $500 million more for construction and cost about $1 million more per year to run. Now, because of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, those at the Coast Guard who would have reviewed the latest report were furloughed for more than a month. But now that the government is back open, here's what Johnson says about when a decision is expected.
The shortest time frame that we have heard from the Coast Guard is 90 days to get to a preliminary navigational clearance determination. So now that is taking us into, I believe, mid-February to get that determination.
Okay, the last time IBR asked the Coast Guard for its opinion, it took closer to 6 months to get an answer. So 3 months is the best case scenario. But if the Coast Guard does approve 116 feet, the process for the formal permit can begin. If it's denied, then IBR will need to switch gears and build a drawbridge. And that's something local elected officials really want to avoid. Washington Governor Bob Ferguson met with the Coast Guard last month, and his office told us, quote, he and our staff made the case for a fixed span and answered questions from the Coast Guard. A fixed span bridge, removing the only stoplight on I-5 between Canada and Mexico, has broad consensus across many stakeholders. Governor Ferguson has been personally involved because he understands how critical this project is for our state. But here's the kicker. When it comes to that 116-foot bridge height, the Coast Guard already approved that number way back in 2013 for the failed Columbia River crossing project. It was the Washington legislature that ultimately doomed that plan, failing to pass key funding at the time. The Coast Guard's approval expired after 3 years, so IBR had to start from scratch. So now, the hope is that if the Coast Guard already said yes to the 116 feet in the past, they could do it again. Well, we'll have to wait until at least February to find out.